Before I introduce our speaker today, McBride, I want to acknowledge that he is delivering the Sylvia Suker Memorial Lecture. Sylvia Suker was born in Brooklyn on July 13, 1912. He was the child of immigrants from Berlin and Bialystok. This latter place, Bialystok, is now part of Poland, but it was then part of the Russian Empire. Suker graduated from Brooklyn College and was later a member of its faculty. In 1936, Suker married Max Suker, who was born in Poland and raised in Vienna, and immigrated to the United States at the age of 8. They had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Alice. After she moved to Santa Rosa in 1982, Suker became an active member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. She took part in the annual Yom HaShoah commemorations. She encouraged local Holocaust survivors to tell their stories in local middle and high schools, a tradition which the Alliance has continued. Over the years, thousands of students in Sonoma County have learned about the Holocaust through the programs that Suker helped originate. In a 2003 interview, Suker said, "You know, life is full of little quirks and twists. You may get thrown for a little while, but then you've got to straighten up, brush yourself off, and go on." Sylvia Suker died in 2016, just a few days before her 104th birthday. I don't know if any of Suker's family members are joining us today on the live stream. If so, words alone cannot express how deeply grateful we are at Sonoma State for Suker's role in Holocaust education. To commemorate that role, the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and the Genocide underwrites today's lecture. So I'm now happy to introduce our speaker, Jared McBride. Jared is assistant professor of history at UCLA. I met Jared for the first time only yesterday when I fetched him at the airport. But I've known about Jared for a much longer time, in large part from his writings. Some of the Alliance members may recall that I am a member of the Russian History Workshop at Berkeley. When word came a couple years ago that UCLA had hired McBride, there was a literal huzzah from the workshop. We toasted UCLA's good fortune and wisdom in hiring a scholar that so many of us knew to be a star in the making. So Jared is a specialist in Ukrainian and Jewish history. He has published widely and in several different languages on questions of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian complicity in the Holocaust. At risk of getting too deeply into the weeds, Jared is a specialist in the history of a region called Volhynia, which today sits astride Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. I have family roots in this region. In the 1890s, my paternal great-grandfather met my great-grandmother there, probably in a village called Lisopol, that would translate as forest village. And this is a few dozen kilometers north of the present-day city of Rivne. They immigrated to the United States decades before the events that Jared will describe today. So I'm excited now to turn the podium over to a historian I've long wanted to include in the lecture series. Jared.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I want to thank even for inviting me, also to the Alliance for the Study of Holocaust side at SSU for this chance to speak with all of you today. And coming from UCLA, which was thankfully a very short trip for a very tired father, pretty much most of the time. And also want to thank the family of Sylvia Suker as well for this lecture. And I'll note Bialystok will actually come up very in many of my comments today. I've heard a lot about this lecture series, which is a real, hopefully you'll recognize as students, a treat for all of you. As many of my colleagues have come here, feel like I might be the last of everyone I know to come and speak at Sonoma State. So it's really a privilege to be here. Before I begin, I want to just give a heads up. We're going to be talking about some difficult material today. You've probably heard a few lectures on the Holocaust already. You're learning about the Holocaust in your class. So it probably will not be a surprise that a lot of the material that we deal with when we tell the history of the Holocaust is difficult. And so I'm going to show some difficult images today, which I have chosen carefully and with intention. We can talk about that after the fact if you'd like. But I want to encourage you to take the time for yourself. If you need to step out, to please do so. As I say to my own students, you cannot be a good scholar or historian of political violence if you don't first care for yourself, right? So feel free to do so if needed. So I want to start today's discussion, and I'm also going to say it's very nice to be in front of students. I haven't taught since last winter because I'm writing and getting things done. I'm very tempted to switch into teaching mode at any moment now because there's so many young people in the room, but I'm not going to deliver this as a lecture, although I'd love to ask you questions as I go along, but I'm looking forward to our discussion afterwards. So I want to start with a brief clip here, and I'm not going to give you any context. I'll give you a little bit of context after we watch it. This is a brief clip of a Holocaust survivor. Her name is Laura Oberlander. Her maiden name is Emmett, which is an anglicized version of Hamut in Yiddish. And she's talking about her experiences during the Holocaust. And this video comes from the USC Shoah Foundation collection, which is the largest oral history testimonial collection of Holocaust survivors in the world. So let's listen to this for about 90 seconds.
Our home was a new building, was such a beautiful home that it attracted attention. Even though our name was not on the list for the pogrom, we were, the German soldier, we were looking through the window and we saw that he said, well, what about here? And so they said, the Ukraine, okay, let's go. There was a whole bunch of them with a few soldiers, German soldiers. So there was a big pogrom a week after they entered our town. And my mother and I were beaten up terribly. They threw my mother out into the courtyard and they beat her with guns. I remember my sister and I were standing on the doorway and we were screaming and her blood was gushing out of her head, and I remember that sound. It went like zzzz, that kind of a sound. And after a while she stopped screaming and they said, well, she's done. So my sister pulled me away from the doorway. And the next thing I know, I was lying under a bed in a bedroom. And apparently they were looking for me. And I must have been unconscious, I don't know. But I opened up my eyes and I tried to get up and I tried to say, here I am. And I realized that nothing was coming out of my mouth and I couldn't move. There was something lying under the bed and I tried to reach it so I could get up. And I couldn't do that. And I probably was unconscious again, off and on. And because I remember waking up a few times and they were looking for me. My mother's brother, Friedel, came.
I'll stop there for now. So what Laura is describing is a pogrom that took place in her small town of Tuchin in the summer of 1941. You would have been tipped off that this was a pogrom because she uses this infamous and deeply disturbing word 3 times throughout this just small portion of her testimony. Now, there are 282 total testimonies out of 30 or 50,000 testimonies in the Shoah collection that use the word pogrom in relation to the Second World War, and 30% of those have to do with Ukraine, which should tell you something about how many of those pogroms took place in this one particular region. Now, you've just seen 90 seconds of a clip. You're not going to have full context. That's actually what I want to do today, to give us contextualization for what you just heard, to understand what happened in this one home, this one neighborhood, in this one town in Western Ukraine. But you would have picked up, perhaps if you're thinking about this analytically, about some questions about what's going on in this pogrom. She mentions Germans. You probably heard German or Germans early on. You heard her refer to Ukrainians as the Ukraines, probably just kind of a linguistic slip of the tongue. But there's Ukrainians as well who are there. You might wonder, who are these people? She mentions the targeting of her home particularly, and she mentions a list. So you might ask questions about the premeditation of this horrific violence that you heard against her family. And you hear her kind of provide some timeline for this. There's a week after the Germans entered our town, right? Which If you know a lot about the summer of 41, you'll tip you off this is likely early July, but there's still not a full, you don't have a full picture here about why this happened at the time that it did. So our goal today, as I've just said, is to contextualize this pogrom in this one town. We're going to finish today's lecture with the discussion of the Tuchin pogrom, but I'm going to get us there via a larger view of the pogroms of summer 1941 across the Eastern Front. And I'm going to do this by first laying some groundwork, giving you a little even more deeper contextualization. And you probably heard something about some of this so far in your course or in your other courses about the Second World War in Eastern Europe, because we can't understand what happened in Laura's home without understanding some big picture questions about the Second World War. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the pogroms on the Eastern Front, and then we're going to return to Tuchin, as I just noted. So let's get started. So what is a pogrom? Very briefly, most of you have probably heard this term in some capacity. If I was teaching right now, I'd ask you all to define it for me and we'd have a nice discussion about that. If I asked 10 of you, you'd probably give somewhat of a different definition of what pogrom is, and that is because it does not have a one defined definition. It is often disputed in the kind of public discourse or in popular memory of families who have experienced pogroms, or maybe you've heard it in other contexts in your contemporary life. And I'm here to let you know that scholars also disagree about this word pogrom. I always do a little bit of prep before I give such talks as I'm doing today, and even rereading some of my colleagues' works yesterday in the hotel. And I said to myself, we really disagree on what a pogrom means, right? So it has no direct or kind of agreed upon definition. We know that where the word comes from, it comes from granit, is a verb in Russian, or grom, meaning thunder or storm. It comes in relationship to a wave of pogroms seen in the Russian Empire in the Pale of the Settlement in the 1880s. The Russian word for it, pogrom, will stick, become a loan word by the early 1880s in English. So this is why we're kind of bequeathed this term to this day. It is still used in the English language. I've offered you kind of a working definition here that, if I was with my colleagues, we could all argue about, but acts of violence against a Jewish community by non-Jewish actors, typically locals or neighbors, intended to loot or destroy Jewish property, and oftentimes is met alongside with some physical violence, which is meant to either kill or harm Jews. There's some other inherent tensions. There's a larger terminological conversation we wanted to include today, but I'm going to skip other inherent tensions in this term, which we can come back to in the Q&A. But that's just to provide us a brief overview of this word that we're going to be using a lot today, which I think is important. I want to give you 3 touchstones for the Second World War in Eastern Europe. And again, you cannot understand what happens in Laura's home if you do not understand these larger points. There are, of course, about 45 other points that are worth knowing as well, but I'm going to give you 3 of them, right? The first is the events prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. As you probably know, the war began September 1st in 1939 when Nazi Germany invades Poland. What you may be a little more fuzzy for some of you is that there's an agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany before this invasion happens, called the Non-Aggression Pact, sometimes referred to as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they decide to carve up the Eastern European borderlands between these two powers at the time. What this means is after the Germans invade Poland from the west, the Soviet Union will come in from the east and usurp this borderland region, which had been previously part of the Russian Empire and is brought into the Soviet Union for the first time, right? And this is important because this is the place in which the pogroms are going to take place, right? So we have this region from the Baltic states all the way down to the Black Sea. It includes parts of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Western Ukraine, and then some regions, disputed regions in Romania. I'm not even going to confuse you with those today. So these areas are going to be occupied by the Soviet Union. The Soviets are going to carry out a great deal of violence against the people of this region. They're going to carry out social engineering projects to subordinate these populations and to bring them under Soviet rule and surveillance for the foreseeable future. This is the goal of this occupation. The occupation lasts for 21 months. They will deport hundreds of thousands of people, Poles, Estonians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, so on and so forth, kill tens of thousands of people, and arrest tens of thousands of people. Some of the 2 most well-known acts of violence during this 21-month occupation of this borderland region, One is going to be the Katyn massacres, which some of you, if any of you have Polish background, you will likely have heard of the Katyn massacres, in which the intelligentsia and military and cultural elites of Poland are murdered by hand by the NKVD, some 20,000 people. And then the final act of violence happens in the hours after the war has actually begun, this next phase of the war in 1941, where the Soviets will execute tens of thousands of political prisoners in prisons all across this region because they do not have time to bring them into the interior as the Nazis are entering the country. So they're going to leave prisons full of bodies riddled with bullets that the Nazis as well as locals will find in the first days of this next phase of the war. That leads us to the next phase of the war. The Nazis, after this tenuous peace or cooperation, depending how you want to frame it, with the Soviets, once they're done with their business in other parts of Europe, which you can see on this map. It's a great map, just a bunch of arrows emanating from Central Europe of all the horrific things that the Germans have done to the European continent in a very short period of time. After they're done subordinating other parts of Europe, the Nazis are going to turn their attention. Do we take questions now?
No, let's
After.
hold questions
Yeah.
till the end.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'd love to. If I was teaching, I would do that. We'll do it after. The Germans will decide to invade the Soviet Union. This is going to be the next place of conquer for them. They are going to open up a front that is 1,800 miles, send millions of troops into the Soviet Union to destroy it as such. It is important to keep in mind that this invasion of the Soviet Union is not just a military operation. This is seen as a civilizational and genocidal fight by the Germans against what they perceive to be the greatest threat to humanity and the German people, that is the Volk, which is Judeo-Bolshevism, which is a boogeyman of a twin evil in their minds of Judaism and communism, which are merged as one. And that there's no greater embodiment of this evil to the Nazi leadership, and this has been so for decades, than the Soviet Union, right? So in addition to military forces that are sent into this region, they're going to send in an entire military force whose entire job it is to commit genocide against the peoples living in this region. Slavic people included, but specifically Jewish people who live in this borderland area. And the people carrying out these murders are called the Einsatzgruppen, right? Which you've probably heard of before. That is important context. This is an image from one of the prisons in Lviv, which we'll return to in a few minutes, of some of the bodies. This is what awaited the Germans as well as Ukrainians when they opened up these prisons. The third touchstone that you need to understand for the summer of 1941 is the local, and I say local, but we mean the kind of national context of these previous states or fallen states in this region, right? As you may have known, or you've come across thus far, after the First World War, we're going to see the destruction of empires. In the ashes of these empires, we're going to see new nation states created. This is great news if you're Polish, because you haven't really had a coherent country since the late 18th century. It's great news if you're in the Baltic countries, because you've never had a nation state to speak of. So new countries are going to be formed. This is, again, for many people and many movements in this region, a positive thing. Everyone wants a state in the 20th century. Some people are going to lose out. One example is the Ukrainians, who are occupied by the Soviets in the East and are occupied by the Poles in the West. They do not get their own independent state. As such, this experience of interwar sovereignty for some people is not going to be a great experience. Even for some of these small countries, they're going to feel continually under threat by their neighbors, both to the East and the West. And for groups like the Ukrainians who never get a state, are going to say, we do not want to participate in the Soviet or Polish state, we would like our own. So the politics of this time period, of which there were other inputs as well, are going to breed nationalist movements, right? Groups of people who, either by force or by other methods, would like to create their own countries, right? Or like to protect their countries. These movements are going to be on the far right. The generous way is to describe them as ethno-nationalist. There's another word that starts with F we could use to describe them as well. I'm not going to get into that debate now, but these are ethno-nationalist movements which are going to embrace militarism, embrace anti-Semitism to a degree, depending on the movement, embrace anti-democratic thought, right? And these movements are going to be important players as the events of 1939 through 1941 play out. Why is that? One, as I just showed you, when the Soviets occupy this region, in addition to killing tens of thousands of people, one of their other targets is going to be these nationalist groups. The Communist Project is not interested in what they call bourgeois nationalism, right? They want people who are committed to a class project and to communism. These groups want vaguely independent states that are free of communism and perhaps other economic projects tied to them, but not the Soviet one. So they are going to kill a lot of nationalists and a lot of people tied to these movements. A lot of the people in those prisons were part of nationalist underground groups who will be murdered by the Soviets. That's important for us moving forward today. It's also important because a lot of these nationalist groups are going to hitch their wagon to the Nazis, right? Are they doing this because they believe in the Nazi project? That's a hotly debated topic. To a certain degree, there's overlap ideologically, but at a practical level, the Nazis are offering them perhaps the chance of sovereignty, perhaps the chance of their own state. So a lot of these groups are going to hitch their wagon to the German project. So when we get to the summer of 1941, we will see these groups oftentimes marching in with Germans to these towns, right? Or coming out of the woodwork or other places to establish power because they believe they are going to get an independent state at this time, okay? That's our touchstones in our context. What happens? As I've just told you, the Wehrmacht's going to make their way pretty quickly through places like Western Ukraine and the Baltic states. There's a reason for that, and that's because the Soviets were not prepared. And that's a much longer discussion. The military is going to make their way through pretty quickly, and then behind the military, we're going to have the Einsatzgruppen, as well as a lot of these nationalist groups, which are going to come up and grab control. In what essentially is going to happen within days of the invasion of the Soviet Union, which happens on June 22nd, 1941, a massive power vacuum is going to open up across this entire borderland region, right? Where no one's really in charge, right? German soldiers are kind of pouring through. Nationalists and other people are claiming power. Who's the mayor now? Where are the cops? Who controls the hospitals, right? It is a massive power vacuum that is going to last in some places for weeks, in other places just a couple of days, right? So it's a very fluid situation. And in this fluidity, we're going to see a great deal of violence against local Jewish populations, right? So we're going to see, this is out of 2,300 localities where there are Jewish populations in this region, this broader region, violence against Jews in 219 of them. That works out to roughly 10% of places where there are Jews. Jews are going to be attacked to some degree by both locals and by Germans at this time, right? So when we talk about the summer of 1941 pogroms or violence, this is what we're referring to statistically, right? And we're talking about 13,000 to 35,000 deaths, right? That, in retrospect, seems small, right? Because we're talking about numbers like 6 million in a couple of years, right? It seems small. But if you stop for a moment by September 1, 1941, 30,000 deaths, right, is a lot of people, right? And killed by hand, oftentimes in their own homes, like Laura's family, or other places in their communities, right? This is a massive wave of violence that is meaningful in its own right, in its own right to study. And it's not just going to be, we're going to look at one city, it's going to be in cities, it's going to be in towns, and it's going to be in villages, right? There's no safe place in this power vacuum at this particular time. This is a map. It's not, this is I borrowed from, and I heard Jeff Kopstein had spoken to all of you recently, maybe not all of you students, but some of the other visitors here. This is a map from Jeff Kopstein's work. It's a little confusing for our purposes because we're looking at interwar Polish territories, but you get a distribution map here across the region, and getting to see where violence is the heaviest is in eastern Poland and western Ukraine down here. Then there's another clustering towards Lithuania. So there are some parts of this borderland region that see more violence than others. So there is a question about distribution and about how much and how little in certain places, but we do see it across the entire region. I'm going to focus on, I had originally tried to give you 3 examples, I whittled it down to 1. So I'm just going to show you one example of a pogrom, just to give you, it's probably the most, I would say, well-known or infamous of the violent events that we see in the summer of 1941. I'm going to give you one example just to kind of lay out what are some of the stakes here analytically, what's going on, to understand some of the methodological challenges, and also because this one has a lot of visual evidence. Okay, this is a pogrom that happens in Lviv, which is the kind of the heart of Galicia in Western Ukraine. It's a beautiful Austro-Hungarian city, which I would recommend you visit once Ukraine is safe from foreign attack, hopefully in the near future. It's a beautiful place to visit, but it was the place of a great deal of violence in the first weeks of the war. But since it's in an urban setting, and since there are a lot of people, and it's also one of the first places the German troops end up in, there is a lot of visual evidence as well as testimonial evidence about what happened. So it's a kind of a good entry point for our discussion today. So the Soviets are going to pull out of Lviv in June 30th, so about a week after the war begins. As I've already mentioned to you, they're going to leave thousands of dead bodies across 3 prisons in the city, filled with men and women, many of them political prisoners, but some just regular perceived criminals at the time. Ukrainian nationalists, and in particular, and I guess I didn't say this in the previous slide, one of the most important nationalist organizations in Ukraine is a group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN. So if I refer to them, that's what I'm talking about. They are going to seize power in Lviv, which they see as the potential seat of a new future Ukrainian government. They believe in this so much so that they also declare a new Ukrainian state in Lviv in this first week of the war. Along with declaring a new government, which ultimately the Germans will not let them have, they will seize control of the militia and other functions of power in the city. The Wehrmacht, the German military, as well as some other Ukrainian units, are going to enter the city as well. And so you have a confusing situation. It's a multi-ethnic city of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, and some Russians. You have the German military showing up. You have nationalist movements trying to seize control of this city. And under this kind of very complicated political situation, we're going to see a massive pogrom break out on June 30th, literally hours after the Germans arrive in the city. There will be ritualistic humiliation and violence against Jews. There will be evidence of sexualized violence and rapes, and there will be also evidence of beatings and killings of the Jewish population of Lviv. Most of this violence is going to center around these 3 prisons, where Jews will be forced to go into the prisons to clean the bodies or remove the bodies. They will be beaten and killed on their way into the prisons. They will be beaten and killed in the prisons, and they will be beaten and killed outside of the prisons after this kind of ritual happens around what the nationalists believe to be the kind of center of Soviet violence, for which they blame the Jews, right? There are going to be multiple actors who participate in this violence, and we'll see some photos in a second. The Germans are there. The Germans are certainly involved to some degree. The Ukrainian nationalists are involved to some degree. There are average Ukrainians who are definitely involved to some degree, and then we also think that there are Poles involved as well at this time, right? So there's multi-layered participation in this violence against the Jewish population. Hundreds are killed by hand in these beatings and this violence around these prisons. And then an additional group of people who are shot by the Einsatz group and happen in the following days. This gets conflated in a lot of literature. That's a problem, but I just want to at least note it for now. You can see humiliations here near the Opera House, which is not by one of the prisons. There was also violence there. We can see these ritualistic humiliations trying to bring to life, to embody this image of Judeo-Bolshevism, right? This is acting out rituals, which the locals are forcing the Jewish population to do. So you have Jews holding a pig while a picture of the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. We have other humiliations. This is in the prison yard itself, being asked to clean the floors of the prison, right? Of this quote unquote Soviet filth. We're going to see a lot of scenes of street violence. There are much more horrific photos, which I'm not going to show you today, but violence in the streets against men, women, and children, and also specifically against Jewish women. And what's important to look at is when we look through a lot of these scenes of violence through this visual history, a lot of it from the kind of naked eye looks to be just random people. They're in random clothes. Yes, we see some Germans, but it's really kind of hard to untangle. I mean, if you can tell me from this picture who's a Ukrainian or who is a Pole, right? I would not know myself, but we see perpetrators. We see people who are involved. We see some children. That's a German soldier. But in terms of the main actors, it's kind of tough to tell who it is, right? And a lot of victim testimony as well doesn't necessarily know. It's a big city. They don't necessarily know who's involved in the violence. But some of my colleagues have done some amazing work and actually shown that by putting together applications for the local militia, some of whom were tied to the Ukrainian nationalist movement, were able to actually match what looked like regular people on the street participating in violence against their neighbors are actually people who likely have some political connection. We're going to come back to this point, but there's this idea here that you cannot simply discern, regular people from political operatives is often very difficult in these fluid examples of violence on the streets. You can see women, there are worse photos than this one of children being involved as well, and even women in their Sunday garb also participating in violence too. So this is a very multi-layered event in terms of participation. And of course, the Germans are here too. Often, I sort of like ironically recording this violence being done by local populations as a result of their invasion of this country and contributing to it in their own ways as well. So Lviv is just to kind of get us a sense of what this violence looked like, get a sense of what the stakes are. And I want to kind of turn now to the historiographical discussion. That's a fancy word for just saying how historians have talked about these pogroms. How have everyone's known about the Lviv pogrom since it happened, right? But how have historians dealt with this issue of pogroms in this borderland region, right? Very crudely, two phases, right? We have 1945 to 2000, which there's definitely more steps in there, but you might say that's a long period of time to be in one phase historiographically. And it's true, right? For this larger first half of, or the 2/3 of the time that's elapsed since the Second World War, the pogroms are almost entirely attributed to who? To the Germans, right? Why is this? This is because most of the people doing all the pioneering and interesting work on the Holocaust until the 1980s really were people who read German documents, and were kind of trying to understand the German state and its role in the Holocaust, right? So this is really, and as a result, the assumption is, especially for German historians, is that any violence that's happening is a byproduct of German violence, right? Or ancillary to it. Right? That if there's stuff like you just saw those pictures from Lviv, that's all being orchestrated by the Germans. So it's really not going to get the attention that it probably deserves just yet. There are some people, Holocaust survivors turned historians, who actually lived through some of this violence, like Philip Friedman and some others, who will talk about the pogroms, but it's really not a central focus of their own work and other people's works. So this is amazingly enough, and I'm sure most of you were born after 2000, but amazingly enough, until about 2000, this is not a major research agenda, understanding the violence that you just looked at, right? Or that I started with Laura's family. In 2000, something's going to happen, and this is what happens. Probably not standing here in front of you today. If I don't read this book when I'm your age, right, this book is going to change a lot of lives and create a lot of controversy. This is a book called Neighbors. It's a very short book. I would recommend that you all read it if you have the time. I'll be using it in my seminar this spring. It is a book called Neighbors by a man named Jan Gross, a Polish-American historian, well-established, well-respected historian, who tells the story of what happens in Jedwabne. Jedwabne is located in the Białystok region. And what happens, and unlike Lviv, Jedwabne is rural. It's in the countryside. It's a small town. And this pogrom goes with the tagline of one day, one half of a Polish-Ukrainian village woke up and murdered the other half of the village, right? I'm paraphrasing. This is the tagline for Neighbors, right? Helpful for history books, just like it is for Hollywood, right? This is going to be an explosive account of what happened in this village, where 50 to 70 Jews, after the Germans show up, again, our Germans are there, after the Germans show up, Poles are going to force 50 to 70 Jews to do ritualistic behaviors with a statue of Lenin. They are then murdered. The rest of the Jewish population is put in a barn and burned alive, right? This is what happens in Jedwabne. Jan Gross is going to tell this story. He is going to really change the entire dynamics of our discussion of the summer of 1941 I would say, for better. And why is that? He is going to bring new sources to the fore. So he's going to use post-war trials, which we're going to come back to in a second. He's going to use some old sources, which we had been ignoring for the better part of, I don't know, half a century, right? He is going to change things in terms of public debate. This is going to become a national controversy in Poland, right? They create a massive commission. Jan Gross is getting death threats on a daily basis, right? This explodes as a topic, right? That's going to bring public interest into this particular topic, right? And it's also going to put it on the agenda of scholars saying, maybe we've been missing something. Maybe the German historians were also missing something. We should think about this violence in a more deliberate way than we have for the past half of a century. So this is the role of Yavovne. We don't have photos from Yavovne on Lake Lviv, right? This is from a pogrom near Yavovne, which you can see some of the similar dynamics we've talked about. Here we have a priest. Here we have German soldiers, the Jewish population being herded here, and then regular Poles. So part of, again, a wave of violence in this Białystok region, some of which the Germans are present for, some of which the Poles are acting on their own. But similar debates as we see with Lviv, right? Is this the fault of the Germans? Are they orchestrating everything? Is this the fault of the locals? Are there other groups involved who are making this happen, right? And this just to touch on Jeff Kopstein spoken here before, just to touch on some of the work that's come out of this new focus. So what is in the last 20 or 30 years, what have been the kind of main themes of discussion, right? How have we been thinking about the pogroms of 1941? And I'm simplifying here for our discussion. This big question of why do they happen at all, right? Why do they happen? And I'm going to kind of lay out what are the main arguments, just so we have these ready when we go back to Tuchin in a couple of minutes here. Longer term arguments, right? Local anti-Semitism, right? This is a region that has seen waves of pogroms for the better part of the last 100 years, right? Is this something that is simply just inherent to the region for whatever reason that may be, whether it's because of nationalist groups, whether it's because of the bad actors, your criminals, the people you don't like in your community, or in ordinary people who just kind of have it's the hum in the background is the anti-Semitism of this region. Does this contribute to why we see this violence break out at this time? Every time there's some sort of there's some sort of problem, whether it's the Tsar's shot, there's a world war, there's a draft, there's another war, these communities are going to turn on the Jews, and it's just sort of, memory muscle at this point. Do we explain it in terms of the longer term processes of nation building, right? We call this modernity thesis. Do not worry, that's way too fancy of a term. This idea that as we're creating new nations, part of the job of creating new nations is deciding who belongs to these nations, right? And in this region where there are a lot of groups mixed together and a lot of animus about things that have happened over the last 30 or 40 years, part of that nation building process is to purify or to exclude, right? And the people who first get excluded in the nation building projects in this region are going to be the Jews. Is that a main factor? Shorter term, so a little more proximate, right? And this is one of the main things everyone's going to argue about. Long term, short term, what mix of these factors do we like to explain this violence? Shorter term, well, the Germans are coming in. I mean, again, this goes back to the German argument. The Germans are coming in. They have a genocidal project. We're not really going to see this violence if the Germans weren't interested in cleansing this region, right? So they're a key elixir to make this happen. And then it's just the revenge thesis, right? This idea of what the Soviets did to these populations. This is revenge for what happened. The Soviet occupation, which was brutal, is raw, and people are simply lashing out. So it's not necessarily that we've hated Jews for 100 years or 200 years. It's that we're just really mad about 1939 to 1941, right? That seems not like the best argument, but this is a very common argument that you'll see in our particular field. And so a second set of questions has to do with our participants, right? So even going back to what we just said about Laura, right? Are there Germans? Are the Ukrainians at the door? Who is participating? This is, I feel, a little less controversial because we know in some order or degree there are Germans involved in these pogroms. There are nationalist groups, whether they're just hanging out, not participating in the violence, as some colleagues would like to argue, or they're involved, they're there. And then there are ordinary people involved as well, clearly, right? Even from the photos you saw, there are clearly ordinary people involved in this violence, right? It is not just German orchestrated. So we know there's multiple groups. Again, how much or what degree of which group in which area, that is debated. Why are people participating in this violence? Again, it's kind of the usual reasons when you look at popular political violence, whether it's ideology, whether it's opportunism, people seeking the great power, whether it's looting to get economic goods, whether it's social dynamics, right? Peer pressure, right? Survival, self-protective measures, right? It's usually some combination of these factors. But how these factors map onto these groups, that's what's really being debated right now, what we've been dating for the last 20 or 30 years, okay? So these debates are important for us, and they're going to set us, we're going to move to Tuchin in 1 minute here. So what we've done, and I've kind of graphed this as kind of trying to visualize this morning in a different way for all of us. What we've done or how we've moved, right, from 1945 to where we are now in these debates about the pogroms, right? We kind of moved from, hey, the Germans were doing everything, closed book, easy argument, we can all go home, to yeah, the Germans and the locals, like locals were doing something. We don't know who these locals are. It's probably a little more complicated than that. But where we are really now, whereas how we're labeling and thinking about these pogroms, well, there's definitely Germans, there's definitely some nationalists there, or there's definitely some locals in some capacity, and we're not entirely sure, but this seems to be where we're at with a lot of the pogroms, right? And this ties into two questions, or there's been kind of, we all seem to mostly agree on this, and there's been kind of two tracks, right? And Jeff Kopstein, who spoke here, isn't the number one track of looking at. So some people, and this is more in the social science realm, but people are interested in, well, why pogroms in this region, not others? Or why pogroms in this town and not this town? Or why do we see killings in these sets of towns where in other towns we only see looting? Right? So it's people trying to map out and understand larger trends that accompany this violence in this region at this time, right? That's kind of a macro view. And then there's another approach, which has been, let's actually take a deeper dive into the pogroms that fall into these categories, look at particular towns, understand what the social dynamics were in a particular village or a region, right? And really also try to get this question of, well, who was actually doing the violence, right? It's one thing to say nationalists, it's one thing to say Germans, it's one thing to say locals. Who was actually doing the violence, right? So that brings us to Tuchin. And so Tuchin, and you can, I've already probably said this, I'm in the second camp, that's what I'm doing. I spent a decade, probably more than a decade just sounds better. I've spent a decade focused on a small nondescript town outside of Rivne in the Volhynia region called Tuchin. And I have been, as you probably would be as any, reasonable or decent, historian, I've been obsessed with understanding what happened on the night to Laura's family and the other people in Tuchin, right? There's a nice quote by a famous art historian who said, God is in the details, right? I am obsessed with understanding the details of what happened in this particular town, right? I need to know who participated and why, and to kind of try to move at least this one pogrom into a new place of understanding. And so what I want to do now is to talk about the Tuchin pogrom, right? So we're going to fill in the rest of Laura's story, right? This is an aerial shot of Tuchin, which fancy things you can do now with history, whereas 20 years ago you would have an aerial shot of anything. So here's an aerial shot of Tuchin. This is the northern part of town, the southern part of town. This is the Jewish neighborhood. This is the center of the marketplace of Jewish economic activity. What happens is on the night of July 6, 1941. So this is the date. Laura's not going to have that at her ready in that post-war, in that testimony, which was from 1996. On the night of July 6th, 5 to 7 men, as best as we can understand, are going to come down this road from the northern part of Tuchin, likely from a more Ukrainian section. They're going to pass through this Jewish market, and they're going to head into the Jewish. Neighborhood. They are going to immediately begin. They're armed with bats, clubs, allegedly spiked bats, truncheons, and other sort of household weapons. They immediately begin to enter the homes of the Jewish community. And began beating people to death or injuring them. We have testimonies of people who were hiding in their basements and false basements and other places who heard the attackers come into their home. And of course, we have testimony from people like Laura who were directly attacked. They're going to make their way eventually to Voskodovska Street, which is one of the main streets in town. And this is where, I'm going to go ahead actually here. This is the street where Laura lives. It's one of the most populated, one of the main thoroughways in the Jewish part of town. And as we heard from Laura's testimony, right, they're going to eventually pass the house initially, and then they're going to turn back and go in. Now, Laura's father, Isaac or Yitzhak, is going to go and hide in the backyard. Why is that? Because he believes that he might be the only target and that the attackers will not attack a woman and her small daughters. He will regret this decision for the rest of his life and saying, I will never forgive myself for making this particular decision. The attackers will enter the home. As we know, they will hit Laura's mom. She gives this very descriptive recount that we just heard. The mom will be laying on the floor. Laura will remember hearing the word chadi, which means let's go in Ukrainian. They go into the house. They beat Laura, knock her unconscious. They do not find her sister, who is hiding somewhere else in the room, and they will also beat to death a woman who is either a friend or a tenant, we're not totally sure, who was also in the home at this time, and her 1-year-old daughter will also be beaten to death. Isaac, really what has happened, will run from the backyard into the house and will give this account. My dear wife was lying at the doorway in a puddle of blood and unconscious. I started screaming and tried to bring her inside. I did not notice that the neighbor murders had not gone far enough, and one of them saw me and came back and beat me in the face. He then surveys the scene of what has happened and his injured wife and daughter. By the next morning, we also have an account from Itzhak what the scene looks like on the streets of Tuchin, which are littered with the bodies of Jews who have been attacked on this night. Some 25 people have been murdered, and a dozen so or others have been injured. And Itzhak will say, outside I saw the destruction of the night of terror. On the street were still bodies. From the houses, you could still hear screaming at this time. Survivors will take some of the wounded to a hospital where a Ukrainian doctor will refuse to treat them, saying they're about to die anyway. A Polish doctor, however, will treat some of the wounded at this time. And this is essentially the essential account of the pogrom. This is kind of a drawing of this village. This is the area here of the Jewish neighborhood. This is Vaskodavska Street that they lived on. And this is a contemporary picture of it that I took. This is Laura and then her older sister, Anna, here. Also, I should note in the aftermath of, and this is a drawing by another survivor of the Holocaust from this particular town. He's done a number of different drawings, and it's very graphic. I'm going to move on. And Laura eventually will wake up 7 days later with her first words being father. So why Tuchin? Have we heard of Tuchin? In the annals of all the Holocaust history, you have likely not heard of Tuchin, right? If you've heard of Tuchin, you're probably from Tuchin, in which case you should talk to me. You've not heard of Tuchin. Tuchin, if you want to look through all the encyclopedias and books, Tuchin shows up in one place, and that's because it had an uprising in 1942, a ghetto uprising, right? So before the population is to be shot outside of the town, the ghetto is going to fight back, kill some of its attackers, and light the ghetto on fire. It's an incredibly heroic event. That gets some traction in the history. But in terms of this pogrom, it really doesn't have any traction. And in some ways, this is an advantage for an historian. It's kind of unburdened by mythology, right? It's not mythologized. It doesn't show up in a million places. There's effectively, I would just put it crudely, less people lying about it. So it's kind of unburdened by myth. It's kind of, there was known that there was violence there, but what kind of violence and why? Really not apparent at all, right? Until my hands. Tuchin itself, pretty nondescript town. The city itself, it's kind of like a town, less than a city. Very Jewish, 2,000 to 3,000 Jewish people in the town. The larger area or county is Ukrainian, which is often the case, and the kind of poorer neighborhood outside of the town is mostly Ukrainian. Within the town, you do have Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews all living together. Typical kind of light industry, pre-industrialized society. This is the marketplace. This is a great drawing, which you're not going to figure this out on your own, but the kind of topography of Tuchin, that is a Catholic church, that is the synagogue, and that is the Orthodox Church, right? So this is what you get when you get a multi-ethnic region of Volhynia. So a pretty nondescript place. To give us a little more context, right? Germans are going to show up in early July. There's some looting, there's some violence. Germans pass through. Ukrainians are going to take control of the mayorship, of the militia, just as we saw in Lviv. Some of these people we think are attached to the OUN, these Ukrainian nationalists, right, who want their own state. There's going to be celebrations of this new Ukrainian state in a small place like Tuchin, right? We're going to have the violence. Then we're going to have a number of shootings and ghettoizations. And then finally, the last mass shooting, which took place in this park outside of town, which will happen in 1942. So what I want to do now is talk about how do we construct this history of Tuchin, right? How are we able to put this together? And then what are some of the takeaways from my own interventions in this history of pogrom? So again, my colleague Jeff Kopstein and Jason Wittenberg say, pogroms are not a class of events that easily yield their secrets, right? One of the things that you notice when you do this work on pogroms, you're trying to piece together events that place a very long time ago in a small place that no one has ever heard of, right? A couple thousand people in this town. And you're trying to piece together, try to understand why this violence has happened. One of the remarkable things that you see is the synchronicity across these sources of testimonial sources. And I'm talking about mostly victim sources, but also bystanders, right? For Tuchin, we had testimonies, I've collected testimonies that cross basically 70 years, right? And 7 languages, right? From a dozen archives. the account that I'll give a longer account in my writing, but the account of what happened that night is pieced together across all these places. The synchronicity to create a coherent narrative, right? Dozens of years after the fact, even though most of this community was already killed, right? Is truly extraordinary to be able to do this. Yes, details are missed. Some people say the wrong night. Some people name the wrong victim. Of course, that's to be common, right? And this is the lineage and legacy of the Jan Gross book, right? Jan Gross said, we should listen to Jewish testimonies. This may seem obvious to all of you. We should listen to Jewish testimonies. We should listen to Jewish people, what they say about the people who attacked them. That was not the approach to Holocaust history for decades, believe it or not, right? Believe it or not. We should listen to what people say about who attacked them, okay? And when you do that, you're able to recreate events that are almost miraculous, how they come together, right? Now, despite the synchronicity, there's still some problems here, right? If you're attacked, you don't necessarily have all the information about your attacker. How premeditated was this event? Laura talks about a list. I've never seen any other evidence of a list. I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure this out, right? Was there looting? Do we want to know if this was just meant to harm, or were they just going in to steal stuff? That has to do with motivations. We don't know yet, right? Are there Germans there? Laura's the only one who mentioned Germans, interestingly enough, right? I have no evidence of Germans that are present on this night. So are the Germans still there? So there's still some things to be ironed out, even if we're taking these things seriously. And the most intriguing and interesting thing, what we're going to finish with today, is the people who did the violence themselves, right? Who are the perpetrators, right? What do the Jewish victims have to say about the people who attacked them, given that they likely know who these people are because they lived together for centuries in one small place, right? So that's where I want to go now. And on this point of synchronicity, right, which is, quite a wild journey. So this is Laura's father. He gave testimony in 1990. This is Laura giving testimony in 96. You just watched this, right? Both of them told me their mother, Pearl, and I met Laura and talked to her a number of times. Itzhak was dead already. Her mother, Pearl, was dead. So my mother survives, right, the attack. They both told me Pearl never never gave an account of what happened that night, right? This is Pearl's testimony that I found in the KGB archive in Western Ukraine. Right? She gave a 2-page testimony of what happened to her in a post-war trial, which we're going to turn to in a second. So this kind of serendipity alongside of synchronicity is really powerful when you're doing this kind of work. So what are we able to divine from these testimonies about who participated, right? As I already said, 5 to 7 people, or maybe 7 to 8, when I did the slide. There's 2 brothers, we think, from a neighboring town, so someone from outside of Tuchin, right? And there's 5 locals. 2 of which I have a full name, 3 of which I have partial names, right? And then some other kind of descriptors of these particular people. So this is helpful, right? It's helpful to get some names. You got to start somewhere, right? And the most people likely to know the names, if you don't have photographs or rosters of people. And I should also note, perpetrators typically do not leave detailed records of the violence and terrible things they did, right? That's typically not how this works. So you have the names of people, some names of people who are involved. It's a great place to start, but it's a challenge because what do they look like? Sometimes it's somebody who gave a testimony, maybe in Yiddish, that was translated into Hebrew for one of these memorial books about Tuchin that is then translated back into English online in the 1990s and 2000s, right? Linguistically and orthographically, it is very difficult. You get a name that's been passed through 4 languages about someone's neighbor. A lot of names are going to get mixed up. A lot of spellings are going to get mixed up. So it's a big challenge to figure out who these people are. The other challenge is how they describe these people, right? They're going to give us descriptors. They're going to say, this guy was a Ukrainian nationalist. This guy was an anti-Semite. Isaac will say, this guy was a bloody murderer, right? Emotionally and probably factually, yeah, that's true, right? That's true from what we just learned, right? These people were bloody murderers. Analytically, we want to get to the heart of these pogroms. That doesn't help us a lot. Even calling someone anti-Semite, right? Were they anti-Semites? I'm sure some of them were, right? If not all of them. That doesn't help us analytically. That doesn't tell me who these perpetrators are, right? And so these descriptors are both helpful and also in some ways a hindrance to some of this early work. And you can see some of these descriptors here. This is this doctor who denies coverage, right? Homanyuk, right? Who's Homanyuk, right? I mean, I can read that. I just know that that's spelled wrong, right? Who's Homanyuk, right? This is what some of these testimonies have. It's a place to start. But where we go, and this is the kind of methodological intervention here by myself and other people who are doing so much such work, is to try to actually put names and faces to these kind of fleeting ghosts that show up in this kind of whirlwind of violence. Who's Homanyuk? Well, this is Homanyuk's arrest file. His name is Vasil Homanyuk. I know his entire biography, where he lived, what he did. right? Until he was arrested by the Soviets, right? So the idea here is to start by listening to Jewish voices and Jewish testimony, and then to put them in conversation with news sources. We now have access to a new set of sources, which are, after the war is over, the Soviets come back in. They arrest they arrest hundreds of thousands of people for things that they did during the war, some of which are related to non-Holocaust activities, some of which are related to Holocaust activities. They will investigate people, interview hundreds and thousands of witnesses, put them on trial, and then either shoot them or send them to the gulags, right? They left an archive with millions of pages about what happened during the Second World War in these archives, which only have opened up over the last 10 years. So using some of this early work, I've then gone into these archives and tried to flesh out who were the perpetrators of this particular pogrom. And I looked at 24 different investigations related to Tuchin alone from this post-war period. And I was able to identify 2 pogrom participants, right? And interestingly, so, you can imagine my position. I've been trying to figure out what went on in Tuchin for years now. I track down a perpetrator. I find his arrest file. But interestingly enough, of these 2 pogrom participants who are tried, only one of them is tried for anti-Jewish violence. In the other case, the Soviet government didn't even know the person participated in the pogrom. I know that from other sources, but they didn't, right? But we still get some important information from these trials. One of our participants, who I'm very sure about, was not tried because he died in 1944. And then I'm still trying to figure out 5 of these 7 people, right? And I also kind of expanded my search on this particular instance to some of the local leaders. And then where did I learn to do this from? From the Jewish testimonies. Because when they're talking about who's responsible for the pogrom, Jewish voices say, yeah, this person was involved in the killing. This person was a monster. But guess what? The people who were in charge of the town, they were also monsters for what they did, because they looked the other way and they did nothing and they wouldn't help us. So I found 3 other files as well, right? This is the kind of the local intelligentsia, or people in charge. And I'm going to double back on just one little point here. And I find Pearl's testimony, Laura's mother, and I say to myself, oh my God, I called Laura and told her about this, and her son. And I said, your mother's testimony is in the archive. And you think to yourself, right? You think to yourself, well, this is just unbelievable. But what do we see, right? They're interviewing Pearl in 1944, and they ask her, they say, did this guy participate in the pogrom? What does Pearl say? I opened the door, I got hit in the head with a club, right? She's the number one person we want to be able to identify the attackers, other than the husband, right, who did give IDs for me. We want to know, she didn't see them. She knows who the people were, likely, but she couldn't ID anyone because she was beaten and unconscious, right, immediately, right? So it just shows you some of the kind of tenuous places that this work takes you. And so to sum up here, what do we get? So I'm interested in fleshing out the biographies of these participants of this violence to see how this kind of reflects on our larger understanding of it, right? And this is, again, kind of a pogrom that's either known as a Ukrainian pogrom or a Ukrainian nationalist pogrom, right? That's just the kind of title we put on this, but we don't really know what that means, or at least I've argued we don't. Well, the perpetrators, from what we know, they have diverse backgrounds, right? Some people are from the town, some people are not. Some of these people are connected to the OUN. At least one guy, I think, is connected to this organization. The other people, I do not find any connection to the Ukrainian nationalist organization. Some of them, at least one person, defends himself in his trial by saying to Soviet investigators, you should talk to this Jewish person who was an acquaintance or a friend from school. So while these people certainly probably harbored some anti-Jewish animus, it doesn't neatly fit into the box you'd want it to, even based on the Jewish testimony from some of these cases. When you go to the leadership biographies, it's even more complicated, right? You say to yourself, well, the OUN's controlling these towns, right? The OUN took over. They wanted a national revolution. They wanted to get rid of the Jews from Ukraine. They're the ones executing this exclusionary violence. The assistant mayor is a Czech who was born in China, okay? A Czech who's born in China. Right? He's not an OUN operative, right? The mayor was an old guy who fought in the Civil War. So Professor Bittner's work, fought in the Civil War, right? Is not connected to the OUN, right? And the other leader isn't as well, right? These guys are, I believe, complicit in this violence, but their biography does not flesh out in the way that you'd want it to if you're going to call this a nationalist pogrom, right? So where does this leave us? And I'm going to kind of finish here, and we'll go to Q&A. Where does this leave us? And I've purposely complicated things, and I'm not necessarily going to uncomplicate them today, but that's good for discussion. So where does this leave us? I think when you drill down to particular places to look at particular participants, and again, I would argue this is a new wave of research, is you're going to find that the framing doesn't hold the way we would like it to, right? Doesn't mean we're not going to use framing, doesn't we're not going to reshape things in the future, but that's not holding the way I think it should. So is this a nationalist pogrom? One guy I can connect to the OUN. Did he get an order to carry out this pogrom? Or does he just happen to be the one OUN guy who participated and the rest of the guys were doing this because they were anti-Semites or because they were bored or because they were drunk, right? Or because they wanted to impress the Germans, right? Is it a nationalist pogrom? It's hard to say, right? Is it politically organized violence or popular violence, right? We know there's drinking. We know what happens at night. It seems to have some spontaneity to it. We don't know why they're going to certain houses versus others. Is this kind of politically organized violence, or does this have a kind of popular violence connection to it? It's unclear. Long-term and proximate causes communally, right? Are there elaborate tensions that are articulated by Jewish survivors of these potential participants that really show and demonstrate a clear through line of communal tension over time? Not really. Right? Yes, they have a lot of unpleasant things to say about these people, but not that these people have been planning the deaths of their neighbors for the past, previous decades. Even if there had been some tension, I don't think that that's a monocausal explanation. And then, this is kind of tangential, but like generationally, right? We tend to think of these pogroms as being carried out by this younger generation. They're angry about the Soviet experience. They're angry about not having a state. The OUN is all these kind of young Ukrainian nationalist hotheads. Well, this older generation was clearly complicit as well in some of this violence as they were in other places. So it works intergenerationally. It doesn't fit into that bucket. Participation, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Similarly, right, any of these kind of things could be factored in here. Is it nationalist ideology? Is it peer pressure? Is it local grievances, right? The biographies don't give us a clear sense, but they give us more insight that it's probably more of a lot of these things than it is just one or two. Right. So I kind of will make the argument. I have made the argument. I'm going to call the convergence theory. It's more likely a convergence of many different layers at once than it is just simply putting or labeling a lot of these pogroms into one bag or another. What does this say about the nature of this research moving forward? Right. I would argue that there's limitations to this macro level work. There's limitations to simply putting these things into different baskets and relying on a sort of typology of violence to explain it, because that typology or that categorization has to hold at the local level as well. This is the argument that we love to get in about this violence, right? I would say it has to hold at the local level. If you're going to label something in a certain way, that has to hold or be meaningful when we actually look at the people who participate in this violence for the first time, because they've mostly been nameless and faceless people for the last 70 or 80 years. And I would argue that turning towards these new sources and bringing these sources together in a new way, right? This is the future frontier of this work, right? There's more work that can be done to unmask people and to get into the biographies and get into these communities in a more meaningful way than we had to previous. But also say at the same time, my own counter argument, there's limitations, right? Jan Gross finishes his book by saying, I do not see the possibility of attaining closure here. Am I leaving you today with closure about what happened in Tuchin? I am definitely not doing that. Even if I had named all 7 participants and told you, all of their biographies and uncovered every secret of their life, would I feel like there was closure to this pogrom? And probably not, because when you go back to the violence, when you go back to Laura's description, when you go back to what happened to these people and the terror that they lived through, and even Laura, who still has a problem using her arm 80 years after the fact. Do we feel satisfied even if we've kind of unpacked everything? Not necessarily, I would say. And I'll leave it with this. I can't really show this to you today, but this is something I found a month ago, in which I've actually for the first time, and there's political and legal reasons, but I've actually put faces to some of these people for the first time as of a couple months ago from some new research avenues. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm Geneva. So you were talking about descriptors and sources and how just saying like anti-Semite or bloody murderer isn't a good description. So what would be a good description?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. So, right. So a good description would be you telling me, how long you've known this person, where what organizations they belong to, right? What was your what was your relationship like before the war, right? And, and so that's not to be expected, right? So I'm kind of went quickly through a lot of this testimonial stuff, right? So, the kind of examples I showed you, one of the most prominent examples, right, are these things called Yisker books, right? These are memorial books. They're often put together by communities of survivors, often in North America, in the 60s and 70s moving forward, typically in Hebrew. Some of them are in Yiddish. And so, what they basically did is they ask people to recount what they wanted to know. And it's not just about the Holocaust, but also a history of their towns or villages or cities. They're harrowing, they're beautiful, they're amazing, but people are just kind of, they can write down whatever they want and send it in, right? And this is kind of this unmediated testimonial source where people kind of write down recollections and it goes in a book, right? If I had come to this project, I was born in a different generation, I would have went and talked to all these people and I would have said, well, who exactly is Holman York, or how did you know him? Or, but people are not necessarily, if they're not prompted, they're not going to go into that, right? And it's also really interesting in a more mediated source, the Shoah Foundation testimonies. You guys don't have a link to the database. Okay. So the Shoah Foundation testimony, some of which you can watch just are open source, right? You have interviewers, and a lot of the interviewers, right, who are interviewing, people's, Holocaust survivors, right, are usually a lot of people from the Jewish, American community of younger generations, right? And so you have people who are talking to survivors, talking about places that have shifted borders, 13 times in the 20th century, these complicated communities. And so even in a lot of those, if you're interested in local perpetrators, when someone like Laura or someone says, which she said, we heard her, we said German, or then the Ukrainians, and it's not clear. If I was interviewing Laura in 1996, I would have said, well, who were these Ukrainians? Or did you know them? Did your parents know them? What were the relationship like? A lot of these interviewers don't think to ask that because they don't, and if you're a volunteer, it's a massive project that's being done was created by Steven Spielberg. You don't know to ask these questions, right? So a lot of this work has been, for me, has also been kind of following up with different people when possible. So, and I didn't put this in the talk, but to give you a nice excuse to do this, I went and I met Laura for the first time. She was outside of Philadelphia. I went and met Laura, and I said, and I purposely didn't show you the names today, right? But I went to Laura and I said, these are the names of the people who came in your house, right? She had never seen them. I'm just some American kid from New Jersey, right? But they didn't necessarily have these names. And the thing that she said to me over and over again was, only if my dad was still alive, because he would have told you who all of these guys were. And so you really, you work with what you have as a historian. You get some passing references to some Ukrainians that may not be the focus of that testimony, but we want more. We want to take it extra steps. And so that's been part of the work, is to put that together. So.
Max, can I cut in front of you here? So I want to highlight one place where your work diverges from Gross. So, Gross has this very interesting coda where he suggests that many of the persons who were complicit in the killings in Yadvabny later became supporters of old-style Stalinism. Yeah. And he relates this to this process of demoralization. In your case, that's truly impossible because the Soviet Union so assiduously sought out these persons, not entirely because they were complicit in killings, but because they were representatives of OUN and presumably later UPA. Right. And the Soviet Union was fighting this partisan war in Western Ukraine. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a really critical difference.
Yeah. So Sylvia,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I'll add to your comment, yes. your question or comment, right? So one of the things when we're kind of trying to ask this question about longer term trajectories of biographies, which is what I'm really interested in. It's what the book is going to be about, right? Is tracking these people across these occupations, right? And we call this the kind of double or triple occupation thesis, right? Because you have California, what would be good? I don't know. The Mexican government took over tomorrow, right? And then we had a new government, and then another government came in, and then then the U.S. came back, right? You would think about how quickly things would shift, what people would then join or become the mayor or the police force, what people would be kicked out when the next government is in, right? So in this short period of time, right? In this very short period of time, you have these massive ruptures to the social fabric of these societies. So part of the big question for everyone, including Gross early on, who did this early work, is saying, well, what kind of are the people who persist across these borders, right? And actually, one of the things I disagree most vehemently against Gross about, and I kind of, basically think this, this guy's a deity, but is he, and because he didn't do the legwork, right? And again, this is an explosive book. It was amazing. He made the assumption not just about the after, but he also made the assumption, I believe, that the people who collaborated in Yevobny and some of these other Polish places were people who had also collaborated with the Soviets from 39 to 41. Right. So if you understand that, and you might say, well, it doesn't make sense ideologically. Why would you work with the Soviets and then the Nazis and then the communists again? The argument there is about a certain kind of personality type, two-faced, double dealer. There's a lot of wonderful words in Russian for this, surprisingly. So there's a lot of, that this is a kind of opportunistic individual, right? And Timothy Snyder, some of you may have heard of, another wonderful historian, is also latched onto this thesis without, I don't think, doing the homework. Okay. So, this is, this does not, then maybe it holds in certain places, but I think it's a problematic way to approach this. I think it's a simplification because in some places, and even in, so the one figure I mentioned, the Czech guy, right? So this Czech guy who becomes assistant mayor, allegedly, when the Soviets in town, he was a good communist. Right. And then he immediately became a good Ukrainian nationalist, right? He's a Czech. He speaks like 5 languages. He's a Czech guy, right? So he fits into that mold. But I think this kind of argument that was pushed early on of saying like it was all those guys, it doesn't hold, right? And the other problem, at least in Western Ukraine, is right, is that the people who collaborated with the Soviet government from 39 to 41, a lot of those people were murdered in the summer of 41, right? Whether they were Ukrainians or Jews, wherever, these people were murdered, right? So it makes for a nice, neat, causal argument, but I don't think it's actually, at least in my own region, it has not actually played out as a thesis, right? It just doesn't work. And so I've constantly, I get that question a lot, and I just say, I'd love to see the proof. So, yeah.
Yeah. Max.
Yeah. Max Martin. His desks are tiny. I was curious about why, when, and how your interest in research in the Tuchin pogrom.
Thank you. That's a nice question. We don't always actually include these things in talks, which you should. And, I was thinking about this. This is when you get old. I was thinking about this the other day, and sometimes you're so layered into a project, or I do a lot of microhistorical work. Sometimes you just have to remind yourself, where exactly did this journey start? Because I don't, all the way stops, right? And so, Tuchin, I was already focusing on this particular region. My dissertation project was on this region, and I believe the first place I came across Tuchin, if I'm not correct, might have been through these testimonies that you saw from Laura, and there's a handful of others that are in English. The Hebrew and Yiddish ones are very hard for me, but from these, English language testimonies about what happened in Tuchin. And that really kind of sparked my interest because of the power of a testimony. Right? And again, in some of these cases, we're all human beings, historians, and we have things that interest us analytically. Sometimes you just read a testimony, and there's this kind of emotional transference that happens with the visual testimonies, because you can see a person. You can watch their face, you can watch how they tell a story. Sometimes it's just a person, right? Or it's just a testimony or a document that you find, and it's all you think about, right? And so the Tuchin one, and I featured sort of almost in a secondary way in my initial dissertation, but I expanded it partly because the sources, kind of just kept coming. And so this is also, we often, historians, like a lot of scholars, right, you kind of, you start a million tasks, and then 2 or 3 of them are going to come to fruition. With Tuchin, and I can, when I showed you on that slide, right, there were so many testimonies that I just kept pulling out from different places, right? So this kind of kept me on the track. And then I had a big breakthrough during COVID, actually, because some of the Yisker books were being translated from Hebrew into English, and they're put online. And I actually recommend this for people. It's called the Jewish Gen Project. They have a lot of translations and testimonies, and different communities can come together. And so I was working with a translator who was going through, I was helping with some of the Ukrainian names, and this translator was pulling out some of these testimonies. I have like, the first graders Hebrew. So I was reading, so I was able to access these things. So, the short answer to your question is, as I began on the journey with Tuchin, every 5 years, something else opened up, right? And this really kind of just invited me. It just kept inviting me, and it kept bringing me back, including 2 months ago where I, came across this photo. I can't really describe how, but I came across this photo, and and it's just the kind of the journey continues. And, I ended the talk by saying, there's limitations, and we have to learn to live with limitations, both in life and in history. And, eventually there'll be a wall, but at least for now, I'm not at it.
Yeah,
Oh, can I put up the last slide? Is that
Yeah,
so annoying?
for sure.
I had some resources I wanted to put up at the end. I apologize. Yeah, I can choose on someone. Anyone else? Yeah, please.
My name is Paige. I can speak loud, so I don't need to stand up. But I was curious, you mentioned the different like sources and stories, and saying that sometimes it's can be clouded by a lot of different things, sometimes, aren't true. How do you go about researching, and what is like being a historian mean to you? Is it about like finding the facts? Can you find all the facts, or is it kind of about taking information and like analyzing it in a way where you can try and describe it without, does that make sense?
So of course, that makes perfect sense. So you've just answered like the most deeply philosophical question about all historical work ever. So yes, that's good. It's a good question, right? It's a good question, right? How do we go about adjudicating truth, right? And is there truth, right? So without retreading debates from the 1990s about postmodernism, don't ignore the scholarly jokes. I do believe there's truth. I do believe historians can find truth. I do believe our job is to try to find truth. Whether we get there or not really depends on the subject, the event, whatever you're working with. So in more kind of practical terms, right? How do we go about figuring out if something is true, right? So, at the basic level, and this is kind of detective work, right? I had an uncle who's police detective in North Jersey, right? Talk about cases and things like this. It's basic detective work at one level, right? You're going to take one source. You're going to ask yourself, what do I know about this source? What are the problems writ large? You may not know the person, but what are the problems writ large with and advantages with this collection, right? Yisker books, right? I've read dozens of memorial books. What are things that show up in here that are a problem? What are things that are good? Is this the only source I have, right? This is probably the first thing you should ask yourself as a historian. Do I have other sources that talk about the same thing? And if you do have other sources, then you want to put them in communication with each other. What's hard, right? And what is often a lesson, especially for younger historians, is when you put all your sources together and nothing comes out of it, right? When you have three versions of one story. And some people that's really difficult to deal with because especially, and not to say like if you're doing other types of history, like economic history or whatever, not to say that those people don't get upset if they can't reach the truth. But obviously when you're dealing with the history of people's lives and the victims of violence, there feels like an emotional or moral obligation to get to the bottom of a lot of things that can weigh on you if you're not careful about how you engage with your work. And so, sometimes, and, take this case, I may never figure out who those last 5 people are, right? My last day, I may never know. And that will bother me. That will always bother me. But you also have to come to terms with these are my limitations, right? And this is what I've put all the sources together and I figured it out. And part of what we show when we do our research historians, right? We cite everything. So this is like, this gets to questions about, is history actually it's actually a science, or, are we just storytelling, right? And so, with history, we show our homework, we show where we got things. But what's interesting about all historical work is on every page, we make 100 decisions about what, we're trusting this voice versus that voice that doesn't even always show up there. The footnotes are the place where I might cite 3 testimonies in one footnote. to get at one particular detail, what happened on one night. But, you know, I can't necessarily, I could probably write a whole book about how I decided to make that decision. So there's a lot of layers to historical work that we don't always see, but is always great to discuss and be open and honest about.
My name's Colin, visiting from the Santa Rosa Junior College. Thank you, by the way, Doc. But to keep in that philosophical realm, I know you touched on what an ending might look like, and I'd be curious if you could wave a magic wand, what would be like a conclusive, solid ending to the story? You may not be able to answer that.
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, it's kind of, I've been so obsessed with the gains that I've made in this particular case that I never thought, right? Just never thought I would be where I am with this particular case. I almost kind of, you know, haven't even thought where I would be happy about. I would be happy if I was able to identify everyone involved. You know, and you know, in my analysis now, and you know, again, you learn to work with your limitations. And also you learn as a historian to know that your projects can grow over time, that, you know, every time you publish something, it's a moment in time, you can always add to things. You know, I've kind of accepted the fact that, you know, I have pretty good biographies of 3 of potentially 7 attackers, and I've got pretty good biographies of the town leadership at this time. But I would really like to know who else was involved. And what I really want to know is why they targeted these particular homes. And, you know, I might have said this in the talk, but I mean, one of the things, and, you know, even kind of prepping this talk for today and revisiting some of the stuff I haven't looked at for a few months, you know, one of the disquieting things about this event and many similar events, right? You look at the violence, you put the violence aside, and you work on your analysis, right? Because you want to be able to kind of unpack the violence. But as I was finishing up, you know, you return to the violence itself and it feels deeply unsatisfying, right? And there's something, I mean, I wanted to be kind of truthful about that, something deeply unsatisfying with just saying like, well, these are their complicated biographies. This is who we think these perpetrators are. And then you have to remember, they went into people's homes and they beat babies to death. This is a fact, right? This is a fact. This is what happened. And so, yeah, even if I've identified all of my people and I kind of have a good kind of social and political biography for all of them, well, yeah, I guess, you know, will I be happy, but will I be fully happy? I don't know, probably not.
So can I follow up on that? Is identification to you about justice? Or is it filling in another lacuna in our knowledge about the Holocaust?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. I would say that's a tricky question. I would say, you know, first and foremost, right, is the work and the scholarship, right? I think understanding the people who participate in violence, which is, you know, not just the domain of the Holocaust, but all types of political violence across the world in many different places, times, in spaces, right? We want to understand why people do certain things, because that's important to know, right? It's important to understand what happened to certain people and why people participate in violence, right? And there are thousands of scholars working with this research. So that's, you know, first and obviously foremost, I think what animates my work on this. And we've seen, you know, this question of Holocaust perpetrators, which again runs a similar kind of timeline to what I showed you, right? You know, for the first couple of days, you know, for the first, I don't know, half century, basically, right? We're thinking about Germans did it. Here are the Germans who did it. You know, first it was, I don't know if you're familiar with this historiography, right? But, you know, first it was the SS, right? It was the really bad Germans, right? You know, for decades, it was just the SS guys. Then it was like, oh, I guess the Wehrmacht was also committing crimes. Oh, and I guess a lot of average Germans were also aware of the crimes and likely complicit in them too. And then it was, oh, and I guess a lot of people in Eastern Europe were also complicit in a lot of different ways, right? So there's been this evolution over time of kind of coming to terms with the fact that the Holocaust, while a German-centric project, involved millions of people, right? For many different reasons, of which is not just anti-Semitism, quote unquote, right? So this has been, you know, this is what animates this. This is what's, you know, I see this work as part of that larger tradition in its own little, you know, cul-de-sac. This question of justice, I mean, you know, on a personal level, I mean, that's where I think there's kind of, you know, personal inputs in ways in which we feel, we feel motivated to participate in these projects. And I'd say, I would say on a level, there's an element of that for me as well. And I'd like to think, that a lot of the people who experience these violence events would probably want, I probably want this violence to be described in this way. They'd probably actually want to see this level of analysis and attention to the things that people did. And I would argue in this case, and this is a larger kind of point about pogroms, right, is, when we think about the Holocaust and the monstrosities of the Holocaust, of Auschwitz, of the Warsaw Ghetto, of all these places, right, this part of it, right, this kind of what feels like, even though I've explained to you in great detail, like the emotional and, really powerful content of what goes on in the summer, it's like a hiccup, right, for a lot of people in terms of our knowledge and understanding. And I'd like to think that, the people in Tuchin who died on that night, right, they didn't know that there was a Holocaust about to happen, right? They didn't know that everyone they know was going to be dead in a couple of years, right? These are people who were murdered in their homes in the first week of a war. They didn't know there was going to be a Holocaust. So I think, kind of doing maybe justice to their story and taking this violence seriously, not folding this violence in the other layers of violence that are going to follow. I think that's meaningful.
Yeah, nor could they ever have imagined that one day a historian
from New Jersey, right? Yeah.
From-
So, right, yeah.
the
Which is
university never heard of.
yeah, which is everyone's confusion when I show up to pretty much any event. So why are you here? And I went to Tuchin, right? I went to Tuchin a few years ago, right? For the first time, even though I had been like a half an hour from it for living in Ukraine for years, and I went to Tuchin for the first time. We got to talk to people and got to walk around. That's its own separate story, but yeah.
Johan. Johan Van Gorp from the JC as well. I have a quick question, but this is all very pushed from the micro, but the macro for a second, right? I know how it played out in Poland once this started to move towards the local. How is it playing out in Ukraine once you start focusing on the local? And I know there's other concerns Ukrainians have nowadays, but
Of course.
the war, how is this being debated and how was it
Great question.
politicized?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So obviously, yeah. People were not happy with Jan Gross. I mean, that's its own very long story. I will say, not that we're, our job is not to adjudicate memory war fights, but Jan Gross won in the end is the short version of that story. So you can tell him I said that. So the question was, this has been an interesting question about Ukraine, right? And prior to, I'll say a word about the war right now in a second, but prior to the war, right? So this question of, was there a Yevabne for Ukraine, right? The closest thing is probably this Lviv pogrom, but there was never really, and there's been some other kind of public scholarly debates about Ukrainian complicity. There was never one really kind of singular event that sparked a kind of, public history fight in Ukraine. And there's a number of reasons for that. I won't get into all of the specific ones, but partly because, what Yevabne was so powerful was because of how it was kind of portrayed. It goes kind of overplayed his hand here a little bit, let's be honest, but, kind of got portrayed in a black and white way. And it really ran up against Polish victimhood. And let's remember, Poles were demographically, next to Jewish people, the most victimized people during the Second World War, right? Horrific experience for the Polish people. So the fact that Polish people saw themselves exclusively as victims made a lot of sense, right? One of the other most heavily victimized people during the Second World War were, non-Jewish Ukrainians as well. But this ran straight into a Polish myth in a way that really just exploded. Part of it was timing, part of it some other factors. In Ukraine, it just hasn't really triggered in the same way. There have been a number of public debates, which I guess in the sense, haven't given the same satisfaction that Yevabne did, because a little bit just a side word, right? Yevabne, what the government did, within months of this book coming out, said, we're going to do a historical commission, right? And when governments run historical commissions, sorry, I wasn't even thinking about that, but yeah, but when governments run historical commissions, call me skeptical. And so But even the government's own, this conservative government, their own massive historical commission vindicated the project, right? So, so there was really a kind of there was a beginning, a middle, and an end to that story, which I think really helped. In Ukraine, there's been a kind of couple blimps. There's been some fighting. I've been involved in some of it, a little bit of back and forth. But despite that, I will say, and I'll end with this to your question. There's been a lot of debates in Ukraine about were Ukrainians complicit, how complicit are they for certain levels of violence during the war. Ukrainians, and to quote Snyder and many other great scholars, Ukrainians are not unique in the fact that they collaborated with the Germans, some of them. They're not unique in the fact that some of them were complicit in the Holocaust, because you can cross the continent from France to Western Russia, and you will find people of all ethnic groups and religions who were collaborated in the Nazi project and in the Holocaust, right? So Ukrainians are not unique in any way, in that regard. And so, while there were, while it was hard for certain people and continues to be hard for certain people in Ukrainian society to accept this, right, there has been movement on this. And this is in spite of, this is where I really want to put some emphasis on this, in spite of the horrors that, you're all probably a little young for this, but started in 2014, right? Ukraine was invaded in 2014 by Russia, and then was invaded again in 2022, right? So and obviously the 2022 invasion really paled in comparison to 2014. So under this, tremendous pressure, geopolitically and internationally in the context of this war, what often felt initially in the late 90s into the early 2000s, kind of along the same time as the gross debates, which was often some of my colleagues and mentors having public and sometimes scholarly debates or arguments with Ukrainians and Ukrainian academics about the war. While those debates were happening at that time, it felt a little bit of kind of people from the West versus Ukrainians, and that's never good. Despite what we've seen and what Ukrainians have endured over the last decade or so, there is an entire new generation of young Ukrainian scholars, as well as NGOs, some of which are my close friends and colleagues, so non-governmental public organizations, who are both memorializing the Holocaust, talking about different parts of their history, and young Ukrainian scholars who are doing similar work to what I presented to you today. And I'm actually editing a volume that will be published by the Holocaust Memorial Museum of articles translated from Ukrainian into English from just Ukrainian scholars talking about similarly controversial things. So, in some ways, again, it's never going to be a neat story that despite, right, what is it, an existential crisis, and loved ones being killed, and a number of my colleagues who have done this work are at the front, right? Despite this crisis, and despite being kind of denounced, right, by Putin and the Russians as all being Nazis, and not all, they're all Nazis, they're all collaborators, right? Despite all of this kind of political noise and propaganda, Ukrainians, an important subset of the Ukrainian intellectual class has decided to deal with head on difficult parts of their history, right, and to do important work and grow. Right. And so that's a really, I think, an optimistic, important point to bring up, even in the context of talking about things that are really difficult.